Thank you, Miranda. Thank you, Corinne. It's great to have you all here in Los Angeles from 20 countries, I understand. I know we are actually on the end of the earth. I really noticed that when I moved to LA. The Pacific is huge, and we're so far away from everything, but that's our secret. We have this little experimental oasis here in Los Angeles. And it is a good place to experiment, and the theme Beyond Walls, I think, maybe has something to do with how we've been thinking about this place. But I thought what I'd do is just talk a little about bending time and space, with examples using LACMA, since we're so involved in it, but just to think about ways of thinking. You know, one of the things that drew me to LACMA was the Brea Tar Pits. So we might as well start the talk in the Pleistocene. This is a Charles Knight painting from 1925, looking at what life was here in the Pleistocene, right here where we're sitting. And you can see the Santa Monica Mountains in the background. And I loved this idea of this staring into this time, the Ice Age, and it being so present through fiberglass mammoths and sloths that are in the park. And a lot of people might think, oh, well, that's kitschy or uninteresting. But actually, it's one of the things that sort of made this site so intriguing. And I was always skeptical about, the idea of a museum as a box, and you bring art things by dead or living artists, and then people come inside the box and see them and leave. And there's a ticket you take as you come in. I mean, that's not a bad thing, but it seems like there are so many more possibilities to think broadly about time and space. And usually that box is ordered in a very traditional way by a Cartesian grid of time and space, chronology and geography, these ideas that are really 17th century ideas that have been perfected in 19th century museums, and here we have them. But art defies those boundaries. I think if art is important, it's because it defies boundaries of time and space, because it channels past to present like a wormhole, and any good art is present. So I take that sense of presence, the idea that the Brea Tar Pits are present. There's a presence of that time. And one of the great things about LACMA is also how young we are. So if you're going to try to break apart that 19th century model of the box with chronology and geography and ordering objects like you would be collecting stamps or anything else, then LA's youth is really interesting because we haven't built up these giant stone museums. In fact, we, on this site, when the Metropolitan was well on its way, was probably 50 years old as we are now, the Metropolitan in New York, the big museum you all know, on Fifth Avenue, this is what we looked like. This is the Brea Tar Pits then. And again, this presence of the tar pits is wonderful. I don't know how many of you ever saw it. Did anybody see Werner Herzog's movie, Cave of Forgotten Dreams, right? So beautiful. And in this movie, I noticed two things. One was that, they really did look like Picasso drawings 35,000 years ago. And then the other thing was, oh my God, that's the same time as the Ice Age and the Brea Tar Pits. So that isn't prehistory. We're actually talking beginning of art. And so the tar pits and the Brea Tar Pits started to have even more significance to me as this time, this Ice Age, this time of civilization and art beginning. What a wonderful place to site a museum. Now, it took a while, because again, as now the Metropolitan Museum in New York's like 70 years old, and this is what we look like. That's Wilshire and Fairfax. See, a lot less traffic then. And there were two airfields, so you could hop around that way, and they were making movies. But, as you all know, Los Angeles grew like a weed, in fact. And if you look at this, 1922, these are pictures in our collection. 1930, that same view looked like this. So there was an explosion of growth here, which explains why so many artists, architects from Europe, this is when Hollywood really starts to take root. Why is Hollywood in Los Angeles? Because you need a lot of light to make film. Early film required light, and it required relatively stable weather, so you could count on the weather to film outdoors. And so we can count on you having coffee outdoors for the same reason and the nice light, and then be in LA. So LA grew exponentially, and the ambition was to make it a great city. So in 1965, finally, just 50 years ago, the Los Angeles County Museum is situated there. It looks a little like Lincoln Center in New York, if you've been there. William Pereira designed this, a civic space. And I'm going to skip the 50 years till mainly now. we have just, in the last 10 years, gone beyond that. So there was another edition added in the 80s, but in the last 10 years, we've seen, again, an exponential or huge growth. We covered a city street that was given by the city, bought a city block, built buildings designed by Renzo Piano, doubled the size of the museum. On the right, you see the old May Company building from 1939. I don't know where, well, I guess there's no light here. On the right, you see the May Company building, which will become the new Academy Museum of Motion Pictures that's going to open in 2 years. So this explosive growth, doubling the size of the museum, and actually also more than doubling our attendance from about 600,000 to 1.6 million. So this is another moment in Los Angeles where you see this burst of growth culturally. And so the question is, if we're going to grow and change, what does the growth look like? And might we play with some of the basic assumptions of that box? You take a ticket, you go in, and things are ordered by time and space in a Cartesian grid. And so we decided to sort of take a leap and start experimenting. So one of the things I love is that I always think it's fun to look at time backwards. I started Miranda's mentioned I went to art school, but when you're in art school, you're always given problems, or how do you look at the blank canvas and get through your block? How do you think about new ideas? And often one of the things you do as an exercise is to reverse things. I think that's true for anybody. If you're writing a press release, thinking creatively, start flipping things around. So for me, like one way to flip things around to sort of think differently is turn the timeline around. Last I checked, I did not get up in ancient Egypt when I woke up this morning. I woke up in present-day Los Angeles, and I think the art of the present sort of connects more to my everyday life. And in fact, it takes me a long time to think hard and assemble the information to try to understand that object from ancient Egypt. So why wouldn't it be more appropriate to even reverse the timeline of a museum? Why not walk right in on Barbara Kruger and her commentary on immediately present culture? You can look from this work across to the Grove shopping mall, actually, on the BCAM, and sort of connect to that everyday life and the present of consumer culture. Why not start there instead of with an ancient monument? I think there's something else about time. One of my favorite quotations of all time is a small text that T.S. Eliot wrote. This is part of a bigger one, that the past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. What does that mean? It means that every work of art, every important statement, anything that happens in the present necessarily, or can, not always, but can alter our view of the past. History is always changing. It wasn't till long ago that a lot of big museums like this included African art. It wasn't till long ago you could actually go to whole museums and see 2 works by women artists. So history's always changing. We're always revising it, rethinking it. And why are we doing that? Because artwork, statements, history, thinking in the present is changing our view of that history. So it is not true that the timeline goes in one direction and there's a causal relationship. In fact, there's a constant rethinking of the way history, memory, and time work. And I think that's fun to play with, whether you're in a traditional way, and we've certainly done a lot of it, juxtaposing ancient and contemporary. On the left is a beautiful work by Do Ho-seo, the Korean artist, made of silk. That's a lightweight and silk hanging representation of a traditional gate in his father's house, placed in juxtaposition to these works of traditional art. Or we had a recent exhibition of Abul Nasser Garam, a Saudi artist working in our galleries, but working with themes that are crossing time and employing images from the past. In fact, our curator of this show was not our contemporary curator, but our curator of art of the Middle East, who's trained in traditional art history and is now the most aggressive collector in the United States of contemporary art of the Middle East. So she is, and her next show is going to be about the back and forth, breaking chronology and thinking about themes, because chronology can be can hold us back from thinking more broadly about themes. And so Linda Komaroff, our curator, did this show and is rethinking her own historical collections, or to reframe our ancient American collections with an artwork, a sculpture by Jorge Pardo, who was until recently working in California, LA, and now in Mexico, where we rethought the presentation, not just to liven it up, but to to really rethink that none of those objects were made for rectangular galleries in Los Angeles. They weren't. They were in the ground. They were objects of transformation, which isn't to say we can recreate the environment they were in, but obviously even just changing the circumstance to make it clear that there might be another frame of reference for these objects makes it clearer that when you walk from these galleries through to the rectilinear galleries with the 18th century painting, you see a culture shift. And it's not didactic. It's about the fact that you can't place every culture and situation in the same frame of reference. And this idea of, timeline backwards is one way. We all have, in school, we all see this, right? What's north? In space, in cosmic space, there's no up or no down. This is just as obvious a representation of the globe and the map of the globe as the one we see every day. You can turn it any way. And so that idea that we're, in our brains are these fixed ideas. I love my first project, one of my first projects at LACMA was to invite an artist, John Baldessari, to turn the world upside down in a show about Magritte and contemporary art where we asked, Stephanie Barron and I asked him to do the scenography, and he said, well, what if we put the blue sky and clouds on the floor and the LA freeways on the ceiling? And he did much more, but just sort of turning the world upside down. This is now in my office, and we own it as an artwork. That turning the world upside down couldn't have been a better way to start thinking differently. So if you're thinking backwards, upside down, my favorite is often inside out, that inviting an artist like Robert Irwin to make his sculpture as a garden outside. And so that you're really in the museum when you're in the landscape, that the works of art outside are as important as the works inside. And then you can start to take leaps from there. So whether it's the Palm Gardens, or, as you know, the relation to the Palm Garden and creating this public space that was so important to create public space, a sense of place, with Urban Light by Chris Burden and the Palm Gardens, and really thinking about that outdoor space, which also includes music and concerts and the energy of Wilshire Boulevard and the traffic, which we all know about, is part of the energy of the plaza. Like, let it be chaotic. There are people taking selfies at Urban Light, in the middle of the night. And I love the fact that the museum, in this case, we had hoped that Urban Light, or I had hoped that it would become the iconic representation of the museum would be an artwork, not a building. And here the mayor of Los Angeles, if you came through the Bradley terminal, you probably saw this poster welcoming you to Los Angeles. And I love that idea that an artwork, not just the Hollywood sign, is now a representation of LA. And what's cool is how that representation is made in so many ways. I mean, we do live in this world of social media. I don't really care that much about our social media numbers, how many followers we have. Not really. I really care more about how many people are taking pictures and sending them to other people. And in this new museum's selfie culture, that's the real issue, because I'm the institution, the guy wearing the suit. Do people believe what I say, or do they believe what their friends say? They believe what their friends say. So the real idea is to sort of create an environment that encourages others to be creative. This is my favorite. And so others are expressing themselves and expressing that to their friends in that case, and of course that multiplicity led to us, I think we're the 4th or 5th largest, most Instagrammed museum in the world now, even though our attendance is a fraction of the museums that are ahead of us, partly because there was an idea to create a kind of place where people want to be themselves, have their identity. When the board asked me, well, you've talked a lot about, I do talk a lot about media culture, the movie museum, we collect a lot of video and digital art, so why are you moving 350-ton rocks? And I said, of course, you have to take your, well, in those days, Facebook picture or even MySpace picture from somewhere, that you need to express your identity by a sense of place. And the thing is, we can expand that sense of place, that sense of importance of a place, in a way that even does harken back to ancient ideas of place. And whether it's the cacophony and energy of events, or the very solitary, quiet sense. When I often, when I come to work, I walk through levitated mass or just pause in the early morning light, and the gravity of that rock and the empty space underneath it, and the way to look at it is really interesting. And as some of you know, that sort of sense of ceremony. You know, there was a lot of discussion in the 80s and 70s in my generation about tearing down the podium and the columns of the temple of the museum. And actually, if you go to the Temporary Contemporary, or now the Geffen in Los Angeles, that idea of using a police garage, a warehouse, bringing it down. But you don't want to give away the sense of ceremony. Actually, ceremony is key. When we made the front of the museum, urban light is of the street, as are the palm trees, but they're also organized with a sense of ceremony. In fact, Chris Burden opened the columns of the lights in the middle so that you could walk 2 by 2, just as a gesture about being together, or this human sense of ceremony, even though, and so we joke that you know, that we have a fake temple facade, but actually most of those other temple facades are neoclassical, and they are copies themselves, whereas ours is sort of made out of the streets of Los Angeles. But you don't want to throw away the sense of ceremony, and I think it was funny when Mike Kaiser talked to me about moving this monolith, you know, we thought a lot about ancient cultures and how this sense of ceremony in place. And we knew that moving this thing would be out of a playbook of other ancient cultures who moved monoliths, and that we could be playful with that. I also know the history of how obelisks were moved from Egypt to many cities in Europe, and then finally one in New York. And I figured, well, we don't really need granite from Egypt. Why don't we just get granite from Riverside, California? That's our locality. That's even more interesting, but it is actually quite a trick to move a 350-ton boulder from Riverside, California to Los Angeles. And there was a movie made about it, and I just want to play a little clip, because the movie ended up being less about the boulder and more about the people and the sense of the portraits of the many people around Los Angeles who saw this.
People are just going to be in awe with this thing.
Static art is its own language. You either get with it or you don't, or can't. And if you don't or can't, then I'm not going to speak to you.
It's going to be a 340-ton boulder.
Nobody moves a rock that big. I mean, you know, you blow it up and make smaller pieces out of it and stuff.
He said to me, this is it, you know, this is the Colossi of Memnon. This has the scale of those ancient forms.
This one's odd. This one is odd.
It's hundreds of pages with literally every intersection, where they're going to cross and what they're going to do. Cable companies, phone companies, power companies.
Every light we get to, we're going to have to swing out of the way to bend back or unbolt it.
Once it starts moving, it becomes really expensive if you have to stop the process.
It's been a pain in the neck. That's what it's been.
Every guy, when he was a kid, you know, tunnels and big rocks, man. You know, he's not crazy. He's just lucky. And a good artist.
Take a look at this, a massive, slow-moving trailer carrying a 340-ton, 2-story tall rock.
They're calling it the biggest mega move since the pyramids.
And decided that this would be taken from nature into a more of a man-made setting, and I think that's interesting.
They parked right in front of my house. It's like nothing really happens on this street, and now something amazing just happened.
I went to the Bible this morning. There are 175 mentions of the rock.
I know everyone is not really here to see a rock, so what's really going on outside?
advisor's work invites an internal investigation of who we really are and what we mean.
That last voice was actually the county supervisor of Los Angeles. And so we had this, who helped us, cut through the red tape over the many years. And there's a wonderful sense of how it made people think differently, and I could tell many, many stories about it. But even that the sense of ceremony, I mean, you think about the cave paintings, you think about early dance and ritual. We can never get that out of our system. So as we're trying to democratize and make our space and art accessible and open, we never want to lose that sort of wonderful sense of ritual. And this project, as it gathered unexpected attention. We knew it would be something, but not the tens of thousands of people who would come out at night and throw rock parties around it during the day and everything else I can tell you about. In fact, it even inspired other artists. Part of LA is that there's a group of young artists who made the only contemporary art museum in Guatemala City, out of a former egg stand, and they thought they should bring it to LACMA in ceremony. So we did bring it with a Kickstarter project. They brought it through across the border into Mexico and into the US, and it was shown. It was shown at many places along the way, and they were also riffing, I think, on the levitated mass and the movement of the rock as they were. It is in Mexico City, and then it came into the U.S., and you can actually see it outside on the plaza right now. I think the second exhibition is being mounted today in the NUMU, which is the only contemporary art museum in Guatemala, which is now at LACMA. So I highly recommend you visit it, not all at the same time. Recently, speaking of social media platforms, I always thought, it's interesting. You have a platform. It's like a gallery. So recently, for 3 months, we invited a young Latina artist who actually has worked with social media to just take over our platform for 3 months. And it was a bit controversial, but it was exciting, and she certainly wasn't talking about LACMA all the time. This is Guadalupe Rosales. She was talking about NUMU. She was talking about other things going on. And part of this LA, PST, Pacific Standard Time, LA, Los Angeles, Latin America, is itself about being within walls, whether it's the Chicano painting of Carlos Almaraz. I mean, there are many Chicanos in Los Angeles, as people know, who don't even speak Spanish. That Chicano is its own, it's not a category you check. It's a voluntary category, as Cheech Marin was reminding me yesterday. And so there's a whole culture here, which is one that is arranged around art and culture. We had many exhibitions here, including this home exhibition that is now in Houston. We have an exhibition of architecture and design between the US and Mexico. A lot of research there hasn't been a lot of research done on the back and forth because that border has stood in the way, I think, even of art history. We are probably the largest trading partner with Mexico now. Our 18th century show was just in Mexico. Now it's opening in Los Angeles. And just speaking about that question of borders, I know all of you can't see it because it's one at a time, but Alejandro Iñárritu has made this incredible virtual reality experience, one at a time. You put on goggles, you take off your shoes, you walk on sand, there's wind, the earth shakes, and you are in an encounter on the border between immigrants and US officials. And there are many narratives in that arrangement, including profiles of the 12 characters or actors or real people, they're not actors, that Alejandro worked with. And that work of art is also breaking boundaries, thinking about walls. You're inside the museum, but he's placing you on the border in a way you could never be otherwise in such a situation. Even that idea of, there's another work just don't miss that we just commissioned. This is one of the things about speed and urgency is that we've tried to make LACMA artist-friendly place because we want artists. Artists designed our logo. Artists design exhibitions. In this case, I commissioned Mark Bradford literally almost by text to make a new work of art for LACMA, which you shouldn't miss. It was made with great urgency in his studio just a few weeks ago. But Mark Bradford is an inspiration as an artist because he's taken the earnings of his artwork and put them into the community of Lemert Park into art and practice, which is art and social practice, working with foster kids and trying to also preserve the neighborhood of Leimert Park, where his mom ran a beauty parlor, where he grew up, and which is a historic place in Los Angeles. So he's working in and outside the museum. There's precedent for that. If you haven't been to the Watts Towers, go to the Watts Towers. And at the Watts Towers, you'll see a portrait of Cecil Ferguson, who actually started work at the Natural History Museum as a janitor and left his career as a curator at LACMA. And so there are many stories about, and he helped develop the Watts Art Center. That's why his picture is there. So the Watts Towers themselves as an outside the box, outside the museum monument, a work of art in the outdoors. Another artist who we showed recently who is inspiring in that sense related to Watts, as many of you know about the Watts Rebellion or the Watts Riots of 1965, an artist by the name of Noah Purifoy, whose exhibition we did recently, had practiced social work and studied to be an artist. When the riots or the rebellion came was when he moved from social work to art, because he felt that art was the healing, saving practice. And so Noah has been an inspiration in thinking about being outside. The first project he did, exhibition, was called 66 Signs of Neon, which was made with nothing but the rubble of the Watts Rebellion. And then his works of art were shown here. So that idea of being outside, in many ways, we commissioned Jorge Pardo, again, to create a mobile cinema lab, where we gave cameras out to neighborhoods that loosely followed the path of the levitated mass rock. Through many neighborhoods, we would park this in parks, show films in the evening, hand cameras to people, teach them how to make movies, and then show their movies and document their lives. That was a really successful project. Artists were involved in that. That led us to understand that actually some of the most important films that were made in that were by veterans. And so we developed another project outside the museum called Veterans Make Movies, in partnership with another organization, where you can go to our website and see those. And so we were thinking more and more that the core mission of the museum is not just to show objects in a box, but to really be engaged in communities. And now we're engaged in North Hollywood, in Compton, with funding from the Irvine Foundation. We are developing permanent partnerships with other museums that have infrastructure. So this is Vincent Price Museum at East Los Angeles College. We now have steady LACMA collection, Chinese ceramics, soon Egyptian art, with a former curator from LACMA who's now director. And so that's an example of, now we have a little branch relationship there. We've actually are opening with LA County money in December, a kind of mini branch of LACMA inside Charles White Elementary School on MacArthur Park. We've been running it for 6 years. But you used to have to go through the principal's office to get into the gallery, and no one wanted to do that. So now we're going to have an entrance onto the park and free admission for that place, named after the great Los Angeles and Chicago artist Charles White. We've invited artists. This is Mark Bradford and Ruben Ochoa, who did the first project with kids, with objects from our collection and with their work, and that continues. But this opening up, so the biggest part of being without walls is about audience and people. And the thing to recognize is you can't just expect to hang a sign in some neighborhood out there and expect everybody's going to come to your palace. And I think that's what we've learned more and more, is that we have to be in communities. We have, as an organization over our years, we have neglected communities. This is the OSCO show that was just at LACMA not long ago, but OSCO's first work of art, of this group of artists from East Los Angeles, their first work of art was in the 60s when they tagged LACMA for not showing work by Latino artists. Now, we've come a long way from that now, but the awareness to continue to open to people and audiences and that diversity is the most important thing, and we must never be too sure of ourselves. A critique, self-critique, is so much part of that, allowing others to critique us from outside and being in a constant engagement with communities. Even artists have critiqued LACMA from its beginning. This is Ed Ruscha, LA County Museum on Fire. In those early days, too, this is a picture taken of the artist community in Los Angeles, and you will note it is pretty much all white men. The picture we took recently with Vanity Fair to document present Los Angeles is a very different picture. And that diversity of Los Angeles, we realize, is our greatest strength. The number of ideas, the number of points of view, and our field lacks that diversity. You may have heard about the incredibly powerful statistics about how little diversity exists in the ranks of curators in the United States, only because the United States is a very diverse place, and we don't reflect those communities. So with the Mellon Foundation, we've gone on an initiative to really try to change the field by training and engaging young people while they're in college, bringing them up, giving them jobs at the museum, and trying to create that diversity. And finally, just to end, we're now thinking about, if we have East Los Angeles and Vincent Price Art Museum, there are areas of Los Angeles with millions of people and no cultural infrastructure. So maybe it behooves us to think about building cultural infrastructure in areas that are the farthest away from the existing cultural infrastructure. A test project is going to be, we've worked with the city of Los Angeles to maybe turn a empty building, empty for 30 years, into a potential branch of LACMA. I'm familiar with that idea of being in communities that, and renovating old buildings. This is Dia Beacon, where we converted an old factory into an art museum. And I think that it's not just about being out, it's the back and forth between the inside and the outside, because you need the central library, the central place, LACMA. And just finally, I'll end with this picture. Everybody's been talking about the new LACMA building designed by Peter Zumthor. It is designed to cross Wilshire Boulevard to replace 4 buildings which are too expensive to repair. And what does that have to do with being without walls? Well, first of all, the entire edge of the building is in glass, and it's lifted up above Wilshire. It is a huge horizontal floor plate. It has no front or no back. Every culture is on one level. There's no hierarchy. That is a lot like Los Angeles. It will continue to rotate all the time, so there's no one story told. And I think a lot of the thinking about this building is coming from the thinking about being in communities in the diversity of Los Angeles, and thinking about a different way, even if you create a very meditative space with gravitas here on the central campus, that it has something to do with that different way of looking at things. And that openness to the street as well that you find, for example, in Urban Light, which we always wanted to be open 24/7. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoy your time in Los Angeles. Thank you, Corinne, and thanks for giving me the time.